Welcome to episode 7 of the Fresh Start podcast with Rabbi Shimon Russell and Dr. Stephen Porges. Dr. Stephen Porges is a distinguished university scientist at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University and a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Prior to moving to North Carolina, Dr. Porges directed the Brain and Body Center in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is also the former president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research and has been president of the Federation of Behavioral, Psychological, and Cognitive Scientists, a consortium of societies representing approximately 20,000 biobehavioral sciences. He was a recipient of the National Institute of Mental Health Research Science Development Award. He has proposed the Polyvagal Theory since 1994, providing insight into the mechanisms mediating symptoms observed in the brain. This theory has stimulated research and treatments, emphasizing the importance of physiological state and behavioral regulation. What is the Polyvagal Theory? It is a collection of neuroscientific and psychological data points pertaining to the role of the vagus nerve, located in every human, and its impact on emotional regulation, social connection, and fear response. It is the polyvagal theory that built the foundation for therapies like somatic therapy in the treatment of trauma. Conducting the interview today is Rabbi Shimon Russell, LCSW, Chief Clinical Consultant and Supervisor for Fresh Start. Rabbi Russell is a psychotherapist in private practice in Jerusalem. He holds an MSW from Rutgers Graduate School of Social Work and completed the clinical externship program at the prestigious Ackerman Institute for Family Therapy in New York. He is a popular author and speaker who has presented on many mental health-related topics throughout the world. His expertise is in working with the Orthodox Jewish community on issues relating to marriage, struggling adolescents, teens, their families, the treatment of trauma in general, and in particular, sexual abuse. He is considered an authority on the challenges of at-risk children and teens. Please enjoy this interview.
First of all, this conversation I hope we're going to have. Dr. Porges, it's such a pleasure. I am so delighted that we're going to have this opportunity to talk about things I think that are close to both of our hearts and see if we can bring some of these ideas to the awareness of the uniqueness of the Orthodox Jewish community is really what we're looking at, trying to help share some of these ideas. And really, this is a continuation of interviews we've been doing through Fresh Start to try and really open up awareness gently, but firmly and clearly to the world of trauma, how it affects our lives. And understand the relevance of the mountains of research. Certainly, we've all learned from you. We've all, it all came down the pipe somewhere, and all of us have benefited. It's the truth, and I say it to you with humility and gratitude on behalf of all of us.
Well,
we're trying to bring that to Fresh Start. I'll tell you something about the understandable nature of the Orthodox community, that almost everything that comes from the secular world is suspect. We start with that assumption that there's something off with it. And, thank God that's changing. And that's changed for us as we sift through and see what we could learn and what we could bring to bear on our lives to improve our lives. And this is a process for us of development and understanding. That's really our hope here, just to educate and enlighten. And that's why it's such a tremendous privilege for me. We've talked before, and gosh, every time I speak to you, I just come away glowing. I'll be honest. It's such a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. It's a mutual feeling, because in this world that we live in, it's really wonderful to find someone else who shares feelings and thoughts and insights and of what it is to be a human. And I think this is part of even this basic dialogue about difficulties within the Orthodox community. And that is, we're humans. And again, part of Hebraic studies or Judaic studies is really about being a human being. and understanding that aspect and learning about it. We can't arrogantly assume that once we're born, we know exactly what it is to be a human. That's why we have, right? I mean, that's why we have study. And we, in a sense, a lot that we can learn about what, I'm going to use this term, we have literally two minds. We have a mind that's very, cognitive and creates wonderful narratives. And we have a mind that our body feels, that drives us. And sometimes those two different sources of direction or intention don't really match. And I think that's when we start talking about trauma.
Sure. The word trauma, just the word and the embracing the notion of trauma and how trauma informs so much of our life story. And when we think we're making rational decisions, and if we really break it down, we begin to understand that the body has taken us in a direction, and it's taken us there for a reason. While we may think that that's a rational decision, we begin to rather humbly learn that's not the case. And that's been a journey for us.
Well, I think it's a journey for humanity because, we're literally the product. Well, you came from the UK. And so the concept of the time of enlightenment, which was not a spiritual enlightenment, but was literally a mechanistic enlightenment, that we would learn enough that we would understand our destiny. And of course, that didn't go as well as people had hoped because we conceptualized the world basically as the periodogram. And it missed a lot of the features of what I call in my own science, the emergent properties of a living system. And this is what our discovery is. What are our properties? And when we start learning that our properties as humans are really to interact with other humans, to be generous, to be benevolent, to be supportive, to be compassionate, then life takes on a different perspective.
Oh, absolutely. And those are cardinal and core principles of Judaism as we understand them and practice them. And I guess what we want to get into, what I'd love to get into with you is like jump right in, if that's okay, and address some of the touchy issues that I think just ought to get out the way. If I could sort of walk us through that, would that be okay?
Sure, but I'd like to, as you started to talk, I was reminded of my trip to the World's Fair that was in Montreal. It must have been in the 1967 or something like that. And I went to the Judaism Pavilion. And my memory, and we can't really guarantee that my memory is accurate, that was all about learning. It was all about this drive, this quest for knowledge. And I don't think the word God or the concept of God was part of the whole pavilion. It was taking this whole notion of what it is to be a Jew was on this quest for knowledge and learning. And I want to just put that out front as we start in our dialogue.
Yeah, well, for us, the entire process of learning, idealized, is in order to understand what does God want from me? What kind of person does he want me to be? That's the entire purpose of it. And of course, there are things that get in the way of that. We're not fools. We recognize that while that's idealized and that's what's meant to be, as well, many of my spiritual teachers would teach me things like, don't blame God for the Jews. We are, and we have to be real about that. And let's not put that on God. Yeah. So anyway, that, there are certain basic things that I know when I work with my colleagues and clients that I know this kind of stuff gets in the way for people. And I'd like to get it out of the way, if that's okay with you. So the first, most obvious thing is this. When I first started listening to you and listening to some of your podcasts and talks, so we leap right into evolution and everything, we're talking about how evolution informed the development, the mammalian development from reptiles. And we understand, you and I, we don't have to go into that. That's it's the essence of how you think. Now, of course, we don't, I think we would rather be comfortable with a picture that less informs us of how we got here, but how we function. And it would seem to, I've always been comfortable with the idea, look, I don't have to get into a debate of whether, we got the Polyvagal theory comes and has to be anchored into a belief of mine about evolution, or whether I can accept this is how man functions. And for me, if God made me this way, then I'm fine with that.
I can actually simplify this, and I hope make you feel more at ease. Polyvagal theory really emphasizes phylogeny, and that is the relationship among classes of species, especially vertebrates, especially the transition in that phylogenetic journey, or at least how it's portrayed as from asocial reptiles to social mammals. How we got there is not the question, or even, I use the term, I say, polyvagal theory is agnostic to evolutionary mechanisms. It's agnostic to it. It really, all it says is we are here. These are the structures, the neural systems that we have, and they have commonality with other mammals. And I'm going to say, fortunately, because then lots of procedures, medical procedures, and understandings of our human experience can be learned from our, in a sense, ancestral mammals. So, we share things, and many humans, of course, bond with other mammals. They have cats and dogs or horses, and they feel an attachment, just like they feel an attachment to children or to a spouse, because the nervous systems among mammals are basically, many aspects are shared. But the real point I want to emphasize is that we don't have to talk about selective pressures and the trajectory of evolution. We have to look in the mirror and say, here we are.
That's it. See, when I listen to you, that's exactly the words I used for myself. Yeah. But, it might be helpful, if you don't mind, just in a capsule, if we could, seeing as we're going to be referring to and talking about polyvagal theory and how it informs us about lives and how it helps us overcome trauma, childhood struggles. Would it be okay if I know it sounds so primitive, but could I ask you just to give an overview for those who are not informed about it?
Yeah, well, the basic underlying theme of polyvagal theory is that our bodily state, our physiology, or how we feel, functions as a mediator. It's a complex concept, but it says it influences how we react to the world. So there are days, of course, that you feel confident and safe within yourself, and you're accessible and literally helpful, benevolent, and gracious to others. But there are days that you may feel a little bit insecure. You may have a cold coming on. You may be ill. There may be financial pressures. There may be other pressures in your family, and your body changes its state, and your patience with others is diminished. That's all reflected in your physiology. So your bodily states, how your heart is beating, the neural regulation of all these organs inside our body, including our gut and our heart, will basically focus on those two, because even in the Torah, they talk about taking things in, or hearts being frozen and taking it into one's gut. This is very polyvagal. So we regulate or affect our organs by how we perceive the world. And if we detect threat.
Pharaoh's heart. God hardened his heart.
Right, exactly. And in polyvagal terms, what he did was he took off the ventral vagal circuit of the social engagement system. And what that meant is that person was no longer socially acceptable, was no longer able to co-regulate with another person, was basically now outside, was in a sense created the divisiveness that we see in the world when people get angry. They basically have no feelings for others. So God hardens the heart of individuals who are threatened.
Right, that's right. So polyvagal theory, in a nutshell, is going to inform us and teach us about how our physiology takes over. And if we learn that and understand that, maybe could you mention something?
Yeah, I actually will elaborate. It's going to tell us two things. It's going to tell us, yes, that our physiology can create intentionality and literally compete with our own need to exert free will, to have intentionality. It's going to compete with it. Yeah. So if we get so frightened, so scared, then our survival becomes the focus of what our nervous system and body will do. But as we become safer with others, co-regulatory, comfortable with others, suddenly we become accessible, and our body is, and basically we're open, and our openness is conveyed to others and they become open. So polyvagal theory is telling us the pathways of how we can calm people down, shift their physiology, enabling them to be more open, more loving, and even from a educational point of view, allowing their nervous system to learn, allowing them to pull information in as opposed to being defensive. So it means that they will listen to other people's arguments. They may not agree, but they will not be combative. So now you have dialogue and you don't have shouting matches.
Amazing. We're so on target. Our thinking is the same on this. As we walk through our world, the world, we certainly a fresh start in those orthodox trauma therapists, we're trying to bring this information to our clients. And this is exactly, you've referenced two things, interestingly, just now, that are quite relevant to us. Let me see if I can jump in with the first one. And the first one is the discussion over free will. You mentioned free will. So, in simplistic terms, one might say that when you're in social engagement, you're in ventral vagal, so that you're aware, you're connected, you're engaged, communication is appropriate, and you're understanding and co-regulating with someone else. Person leaves that into the sympathetic and the fight and flight, and then may go to dorsal vagal into freeze. We understand that. Here's the question. At what point, is there a point, how do you think, this is really the question, not the point, how do you think about the issue of free will, as in the sense that we understand that when someone's in ventral vagal, someone's in social engagement, we presume they have pretty much access to free will.
Yeah.
And that's diminished or impaired as you move out through the other states.
Yeah.
How do you think about the, what do we retain of free will? Where does it go?
Well, where does it go? I would use the term we lose access to it, which is that doesn't go anywhere. We can't access it to it. And if you thought of it in terms of neural structures or even developmental structures, we are recruiting basically immature circuits, or circuits that mature at the first in our body, which are really circuits of survival. So the free will of which we're talking about, which is the sense of agency where we have control, is shifted to a will of survival of a more primitive nervous system. A frightened cat in your corner, or if a squirrel walks into your house by mistake, it's going to be very, very upset and reactive, and you're not going to be able to walk up and pet the squirrel, even though your intentions are good, because the cues to that animal are that of threat. Now, in the world we live in, and this is where we have to be extraordinarily respectful of this difficult quest that we all are on, and it's a quest to find safety in the world that we are dropped into. So we don't have free will about that. We are here. And our job, the free will, from my point of view, is we have to learn to navigate within complex settings so that even if we're confronted with threat, we are aware of that threat and what it does to our body. And we have to honor what our body needs. It may need rest. So again, going back to biblical scriptures, the notion of what do you do on the Shabbat? What do you do? You're not supposed to work. It doesn't mean that you carry things within a wire, which they do in communities, or you create some other type of a way of fooling, God. You take what the message is. The message is this is now time not to be consumed with what you do during the rest of the week. Understand what the metaphor and what the scriptures are really saying. It's a time to take care of yourself, your mind and your body, to, in a sense, let these things pass from you. And we forget this notion that we have to do self-care. We think that we have responsibilities. It doesn't matter whether you're in the Orthodox community or not. The world that we live in basically instructs us. It gives us a set of instructions. And that is make a secure world for yourself and your family. But what is that metaphor translated to? It says, resources, community. You have to be around those that will take care of you, and you have to have enough resources to pay for it. And so it creates a tremendous amount of stress or discomfort. Let's even throw the word stress out. What it's doing is changing our physiological state, because we live in a world where we are under 24 hours, 7 days of the week evaluation. And I'm going to even elaborate on that, because what is medicine? When you're ill, what do? You go to a physician, and what do? They do tests. And do you develop any sense of expectancy or anxiety about the test? Of course you do. When you're in school, what do you have? You have tests. Do you develop an anxiety or a fear of what's going on? Because all these things impact on your survival. They're not even metaphorical. They are actually threats to our survival. So what's wrong with a society that structures everything as assessment? It takes out of our human experience opportunities to go on cooperative journeys to learn about ourselves. So wouldn't medicine be more welcomed if it was a journey to learn about your body, its vulnerabilities, and also how to optimize it? Wouldn't education be much more accessible and interesting, exciting, and pleasant if it was about a shared journey of learning and exploration?
Excellent. So the idea really behind all the polyvagal theory is trying to help someone learn how to come to a place of safety from which you can really connect. Because when you're not in a place of safety, you can't. You're really into your own personal survival.
You're into survival. But what polyvagal theory gives us, let's really say, I don't even take credit for it, because these are things that you come to people who study and who put things together, who ask questions, but it's really the accumulation of, let's say, centuries of knowledge from other visionaries. And what it tells you is that as a human, our main way of feeling good or regulating our bodily state, our physiology, is through cooperation with others. It's through mutually beneficial social interactions. Our sociality is like medicine. Our sociality changes our physiological state and enables our health, the processes in our body, to optimize their function. So it helps us heal, it helps us grow.
So if I can go back to the question in the context of the way you've described the sociality and being safe, person is faced with a threat. They believe that their mind ought to be able to keep them sensitive, focused, kind, in attuned communication. Their mind informs them of the way they ought to be. The body hijacks. And I want to just, if I can mention two subtleties here, just because I'm dying to hear your response to it. I've been waiting to hear how you think about this, because I often wonder whether it's like a switch, a fuse that gets switched, and it's an on or off. It's like binary, you're there or not, or more like a dial, like, you slow it down, you have full access, you have some access. How do you think about that concept?
Well, I would basically ask you, have you seen people who apparently in the initial interactions seem sane and reasonable, and then something happens? They misinterpret something you say, and they go ballistic. Have you ever seen that? So is that an analog dial, or is that a switch?
To me, it looks like a switch. Although I must tell you, I've wondered watching them whether it seems to be turning off very slowly and then boom.
Oh, well, the issue is the retraction of that social engagement system can be graded. That can be, but once it gets into a state of vulnerability, the system changes state. So think about water boiling.
Yeah.
Okay, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then suddenly it starts to bubble. And this, so we start seeing state changes in the molecule of H2O. It can be a solid like ice, it can be water, and it can be steam. And in a sense, it's the same molecule, and it shifts state, but there are changes on that analog scale of temperature that lead into greater, let's say, susceptibility to be a gas, to be a fluid, or to be a solid.
But
We are the same. We're the same.
At some point, that switch can happen, and a person considered like, to me, it looks offline. They're just not.
Well, it looks offline for you. It may not necessarily look that offline for me. I may be picking up other cues that I would be really identifying. I would start looking at loss of neural tone to the upper part of the face. I would start looking at muscle tension in the body. And even though the person appears to be in control, that's a thin veneer. I could, you start seeing it. And I think when people take polyvagal theory and seriously use it within a therapeutic setting or educational setting or a workplace setting, they become much more aware of the vulnerabilities of others. And having vulnerabilities is not wrong, but having vulnerabilities requires a degree of support. And that support is really, let's use terms that are kind of cliche, acceptance, loving kindness, compassion, sympathy, empathy, all these words that float around. But what we're really saying is that, and actually this is a word I'm starting to introduce into my talks, we have to become a good witness. We have to be, in a sense, a good listener to others, a good witness, and not an evaluator. What that really means is we at many times don't have to say anything. We just have to be there. And in your experience as a therapist, it must have been kind of almost like a binary switch for you. Once you realized that your job wasn't to reframe their experience and interpret it, your job was to allow them to express it.
Correct. Couldn't be more accurate. That would be more online for us once we recognize that. So here's a critique levied frequently at us that, again, I'd like you to comment on, if that's okay. That it sounds like we're making an excuse. We're saying, look, you're offline, so now you don't have access to the better part of who you are.
Yeah.
Are we giving excuses to people to excuse their behavior? So this is a common.
Yeah, I'm going to build a parallel, and I'm going to, first of all, hopefully, it's not going to be offensive to anyone, but it's the same dialogue with advocacy groups for disorders like autism. So they say, we shouldn't try to change the autistic individual. We should change the world around the autistic one so they can function. And I'm saying you're missing something important. The important part is that when you, as a human being, can find joy in interacting with others, wouldn't you want your autistic child to have those same experiences? And so the issue is, it's not curing autism. It's saying that we can, through a polyvagal perspective, potentially trigger the system that enables more social interactions to occur. And so what we want to really say is we come into the world with potential. And often in our life, we are challenged. And sometimes we get stuck in the states that are not the most advantageous for us as humans, which means states that facilitate accessibility and enable us to co-regulate, or to be supported and to reciprocally support someone else. So when we're in a sense, let's go back to God hardened. What was it with the heart? What was the term actually?
Right. God hardened Paro's heart.
Yeah. So and of course the interpretation made him stubborn, right? That was really yeah. Right. So that was the word. And of course, when we lose that social engagement system, that ventral vagal control of the heart, what happens to our heart? Yeah. We become stubborn. Now, right. But when we're stubborn, we're really in a defensive mode. We're in a state of trying to protect ourselves. So we're not in a state of, this is the whole part of the problem in terms of historical retellings of history. And that is, we expect that victorious armies will dominate those that they defeat, but those that defeat will now be accessible to them. And, so the issue is we have to understand that threat to one results in threat to the other. And so, we have to be very understanding that we're not making friends by beating them up. We're surviving ourselves in cases of war and conflict. But the real issue of how humans interact and feel comfortable with each other is not through warfare, but through social interaction. And this is the part that gets so minimized, because in our world, we talk about reducing threat, but we don't talk about increasing cues of safety. So we want to reduce threat, but we want to increase cues of safety. And in the United States, in terms of the school systems, it's about guards at doors or principals carrying guns. This is all about threat, but those are not cues of safety to the students. The cues of safety are facial interactions, smiling, intonation of voice, gesture. Our body knows what cues of safety are. And, if you want to, in a sense, pet a dog, if you don't know how to pet an animal, you know that you don't know what cues of safety are. But if you know how to pet an animal, a dog or a cat, the gentleness, the vocalizations you use, it's like talking and holding a baby. Those are the cues of safety, and we never grow out of that need. So when a person's voice has a melodic tone to it, and there's a gesture reaching for you and a smile on the face, we melt.
That's right. So actually, we can just take the idea of co-regulating. You've mentioned learning, and for one of the huge issues that we face in the Orthodox world, puts a tremendous bias towards learning and scholarship. So our children grow up in school systems that are, heavily leveraged towards scholarship, have very little of anything else outside scholarship. And of course, children develop and mature at different stages and rates, leaving some feeling, and quite a lot of them feeling, like I failed within this system, which is something we refer to, and I work through, we refer to as learning trauma.
Yeah.
Because their reaction is exactly as you describe, is, I'm going to adapt by survive by shutting this out because I can't cope with it. I think what I'm hearing you say is that the correct approach for children who are having a hard time with their studies, with learning, and are feeling, so to speak, traumatized by the system, they're reacting adaptively to resist it, is to use ourselves, our facial expression, our body language, the co-regulation. Because if we could be aware through neuroception of what's going on with the student, and use ourselves in a loving way to create safety in learning. Is that right?
Well, yes, and I would actually emphasize that's the primary process of being a good witness to your own child, as opposed to, like, I think we all as parents have been guilty of this, of thinking, well, I could do that, why can't you? Or you'll have to learn to do that to survive, as opposed to truly listening and understanding the difficulties of that unique child's experience, that their bodies didn't feel safe, and that you as a parent are there. Your primary role is not to criticize them or to tough love model of them, but to be their support, their unconditional support. And, I think we've been given the wrong lessons. I want to go back to the notion of how education is delivered. It's delivered with the assumption that any time that is not used in cognitive or mental exercises is wasted. So there's a sense, what gets removed out of the curriculum? Well, play, often music, often the arts. What we forget is that bodies like to play, and there's nothing wrong with play, but play is a neural exercise that helps create the resilience of that nervous system for that child to sit in the classroom for 6 hours a day or 7 hours a day. And it's also a developmental phenomenon, so that resilience or neural systems develop over time. So that if we invest more time in social interactions and organized play, meaning reciprocal behaviors, early in development, the child will be more accessible to learning. So it's almost viewed as a paradoxical. We treat children as if they're miniature adults, but they have different needs. They're growing, and their nervous systems, even though their intention, their free will, wants for a child, they want to sit still. Their body, in a sense, going back to your own words, hijacks them. They have to move. They have to move, and it interferes with the objective of reaching the objective, which is to do well in school.
So let's take that a little further. In our world, where learning for men, for sure, is part of our life permanently. It's something we do every day, and it's forever part of our life and part of how we conduct ourselves through always learning and studying Torah. Obviously not a full day anymore when you leave the school systems and the higher education systems, but nevertheless, it's part of our lives. We encounter a large number of people, far too many, who during their early years, the elementary, high school, and those years experienced what we now understand to be learning trauma. And so their adaptation was to resist it and not see it as a safe place, who later on in life as adults and heads of families want to have access to that again, find themselves thrown offline. Just looking at the books throws them offline. The PTSD is still there. It's something they can leave behind them. It's something they want to embrace.
Yeah, well, it tells you something deep inside the body. And this is a type of learning that could be called classical conditioning or associative learning. So the visceral or bodily feelings of those unpleasant experiences are triggered by the presence of the volumes that their higher brain now wants to investigate. And now the presence of it gets them into a physiological state. The part that I think we may have slipped by in our comments was that if we're learning under a trauma model, or if learning is traumatic, and this is the way it is in many environments, we're not accessing all of our intellectual capacity. Right. So our creativity, our insights are compromised and replaced with what we can do in lower areas of the brain, like rote memory. So we misunderstand what our objective is in the educational model. And this is in part due to the types of assessments. So if we're asking for a recapitulation of information, memorization, the kids may do extraordinarily well who are in these very strict and, let's use the term, repressive or controlling environments. But give them an open-ended problem, they can't go there. So they end up with another type of traumatic type response. And that is, they need the predictability of the questions that they're dealing with. And if it's predictable, that predictability is a metaphor for the nervous system of safety. And creativity is a metaphor for uncertainty and therefore danger.
So, in fact, what I'm hearing you say so clearly is both in the early stages of, in our world, again, religious development through learning, studying, and prayer, creating a safe environment for that is not just crucial in order that a person should want to have access to that for the rest of their lives in a positive and informative and helpful way, but actually the experience itself is diminished if it's not a safe environment, because the child will be in a place where they're adapting to survive and therefore limiting access to higher parts of their brain.
The beauty of contemporary neuroscience is that we can actually see what areas the brain light up. And if you have a person in a state of threat, they're not, access to certain areas just won't occur. And so I marvel at how many, let's say, individuals have survived the educational model. And because many people tend to be extremely anxious and really, meaning their bodies are in a constant state of threat. And, they're in a sense trying to survive in a world that is really hurting them, as opposed to, I think the bottom line of your point is, what if the world was embracing them?
Absolutely.
What would happen?
They'd learn better and
Yeah.
they learn longer, and they would put that into their lives as a positive instead of a
Well,
point.
they would also learn in almost a cooperative,
Right.
collaborative way, that they wouldn't be learning in an isolated manner. They'd be part of a group that's on an intellectual journey. And I even have my own kind of perspective on how we reach states of spirituality. That if we are, in a sense, in this more witness, more cooperative vision, then our spirituality is much more of a group spirituality. It's much more invested and involved in relationships with others. But when we're under threat, it becomes a very narrow type of spirituality that may have some values in terms of spiritual experience, but it doesn't create the same type of community.
Oh, so I have two comments. This is so rich for me. You can't imagine. It's like every word you say validates how I feel. It's so such an awesome feeling. I can't. It's embodied, deeply embodied, really. But so in the learning arena, creating safety is not just nice to children, but it's actually crucial.
Yeah.
Entire development of a child's ability to access the best of what they have and to achieve the most they can with their lives.
See, what you're talking to me about is about my experience when I went to the World's Fair in Montreal in '67. I said, I went to the Judaism Pavilion, and I said, they didn't mention God. It was all about learning. And this is what you're talking about. You're saying, what if we had a think tank together? Let's start with you and me. And we started to develop, say, what would a educational model look like that was co-regulatory, inviting, had characteristics of witnessing and supportive?
Sure.
What would be the trajectory of learning? Because what we're doing in that model is we're really vesting our beliefs in the individual's inherent free will or desire to learn, not what we're imposing on them through threat.
Exactly.
And so the issues when you impose threat, the free will is survival. When
That's
you
right.
impose this other model, the free will says creativity, discovery, sharing,
Absolutely.
giving.
I think marvel, if we would actually do, we would marvel at the results.
Yeah.
And it aligned with what you said about, prayer, take prayer, that, working, we have also many people that who struggle with, and prayer is part of our life, obviously. We
Yeah.
pray 3 times a day, and going to the synagogue, going to the yeshiva, the school, whatever, to prayer is part of our lives. And so many people had those early experiences where the pressure and intensity, unfortunately, and again, I'm not here to judge or, that's not my thing at all, but just to reflect upon the well-meaning but uninformed pressure placed on children who to this day are now in their 40s and 50s and have actually a hard time walking in to do the act of service of prayer into a synagogue or yeshiva, and they don't know why. They don't know why they're having like panic attacks just being there.
Yeah. The answer is real simple, and that is the association was so powerful, and the associations were, I use the term, very visceral. They were very much into their body to such a, let's use the term again, primitive level that they couldn't function. And as they got older and had more agency or control of their life, they said, I'm just going to avoid this.
So can we throw good news out there for people? Because we used to have a thought that someone who's still experiencing the same mechanisms that caused the trauma in the first place. So let's say PTSD or CPTSD, and the same mechanisms like learning or prayer that caused those adaptive reactions when they were a child. And now they want it as adults. I want to pray and I want to learn. But the connections are there. So what can we tell them that's positive, even though they're not going to separate from it? I want to be there and do it.
Yeah, well, I think the technology or the methodology of bringing them into that environment in which their bodies feel safe is relatively straightforward. the way of downregulating these threat reactions is through cues of safety.
Yeah.
So like a person, let's say a person like you, you're a cue of safety to people. And in a sense, if I'm going to say if you could be cloned, but in a sense, the features that you express that are basically successful in calming people and making them feel safe in environments that had previously been triggers to them, I think it becomes literally, it's almost like a recovery. It's like an addiction recovery. You're saying, how do we recover from this? Well, there's certain features. You can't do it by yourself. Right. You have to be around people that you trust, and they have to have, be accessible and respectful of you. So we know really what we're talking about, and we create those environments. And what I am trying to do at this stage of my life is trying to literally inform different types of treatment models. And one of them happens to be addiction. And if we can kind of generalize from addiction to what you're talking about, and I feel that what's missing in the addiction world is that it's primarily focused on group psychotherapy, which is good, but it's not sufficient. If it were sufficient, you wouldn't have revolving doors where people are going back. I think what's important is for people to go on a journey of understanding their body, understanding their bodily responses, and not to be afraid of them, embarrassed by them, but to understand them. And through that understanding, they learn to regulate them through other cues. And like, I will give you an example. I hurt my back a year ago. I was in very chronic pain, but I was still doing podcasts and webinars, and I was pain-free while doing them because I was socially interacting with others. Right. So I learned that even during the pandemic, with the limited social interaction of Zoom, it was sufficient to enable me not to feel pain. I felt good. I felt connected. Now, it took time for it to heal. It's not that it went away, but while interacting, I was fine. So it tells you the power of social interaction in our physiological state. And really what I'm saying is we can literally neutralize these threat reactions with cues of safety, accessibility, welcoming.
Yeah, I think actually a fresh start, it's a 1-week workshop. How much we hope. People ask me all the time, what do you hope to do? And I've made the comment time and time again, if we could help people see just what you just described, experience that for a week, that you could actually learn to regulate yourself, you could bring yourself back into social engagement, and we can help you facilitate and learn that's possible.
Yeah. Well, I think what's happening in a week where there are other people on that journey is there's a networking, a collaboration, a connection. And then there are moments in which you feel back in control, feeling good, feeling not just feeling good, but feeling good enough to give to others. So it's a real interesting set of issues. We live in, of course, in a world that says, what about me? And the issue is we need to, that's not the world we should be in. We should be in a world as, what about you? How are you? Exactly. This goes back to some other research that I've done with autistic kids. I was doing a project on looking at reciprocal behaviors of control kids and autistic kids. And of course, my initial conclusion, let's say, hypothesis was that, well, typically developing kids are going to have reciprocal behaviors. And autistic kids, they're going to be non-contingent. Well, those are blinders. Okay, this is how we see the world. But when you analyze the data, the autistic kids were literally 100% contingent, but they were negative. Okay, so this is the issue of, under threat. When your body's under threat, you're not non-contingent, you're just not compliant. You reliably withdraw. And I'm saying that this is part of the world that you're talking about as well, that the system has recognized that it has to withdraw. It can't be compliant. Correct. And when you create in your workshops and in your retreat, you create a collaboration with others in a supporting environment that is literally swimming or providing an ocean of cues of safety. The body, basically, we're easy. You know, a few smiles, a few intonations of voice, we open up.
Yes,
it's amazing, and you know, it's what we've inherited. This is part of who we are. It's part of our body, and by the way, it's probably influenced how prayers were even structured, because of the sounds and repetition and rhythms and unison of how, let's say, chants or prayers are expressed, that our nervous system, whether we understand the language or not, is almost irrelevant. Our body welcomes it.
That's correct. Beautiful. Okay, so let's one more thought. And I know this one's close to home for you, and you've got a lot of personal sort of knowledge of this experience. We have a lot of people who come to us in Fresh Start who we help them recognize, even though it's 75 years later, but they have embodied Holocaust trauma that's kept with them, you know, generational, and it's still there. And we see it in two areas specifically: those that during the Holocaust, for obvious reasons, shut down love. So they do love, they do caring, they do food, they do shelter, they do clothing, but they don't do love because that was too painful. And then the others who seem to hover over, enmeshed with hoping to protect their children with anxiety and become enmeshed in their lives. And this is 3 generations or 4 generations later, and we see it right there.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, I'm basically very interested in it. And of course, this concept of transgenerational, not just intergenerational, but transgenerational is critical, because my family's history was not, they weren't directly affected by the Holocaust. They came over at the turn of the 20th century. But the point is, they also abandoned family. They went through a lot of insecurity. And then the relatives that didn't come over, those were the ones that didn't survive. And for my grandmother, I mean, I think I shared this with you, that in her living room, she had a coffee table, and under the piece of glass of the coffee table were the pictures of her family. And she would point out each one that had been killed in the Holocaust. And, you know, I'm a little kid. I'm listening to this and watching this. And then, you know, I went to Israel in 1964. And Israel, of course, was just growing. And I was seeing people who would pull their sleeves up and read their numbers off to me and made sure that I would see it. Now, as an 18-year-old, the response to that is very different than as a 76-year-old. So as an 18-year-old, I'm looking at the individual and saying, oh, he's alive. You know, he should be grateful, thankful for being alive. I did not acknowledge what he had observed, loss of his loved ones.
Yeah.
I didn't witness it. I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't honor it. And this is part of what happened to, I would say, in the US, to American Jews who avoided the Holocaust, or even the Holocaust survivors who came over. They made, in a sense, a decision not to revisit those bodily feelings. And we have close friends who talk about their parents waking up in the middle of the night screaming.
Sure, of course. So a lot of our work we have seen as reorienting people to be aware how those themes still exist in their body.
Yeah.
This is a tremendous shock to their awareness.
Yeah, it got changed. You see, this is really, okay, so in Jewish populations, and I assume within the Orthodox segment as well, there's a sense of, I would say, outside or paranoia of the outside. And part of that has to deal with the view that the society is not welcoming, it's not supportive, it's dangerous. And in places it is. I mean, that's the other part of it. And so in one sense, it's an overreaction, but in another sense, it's reality. And this creates the confusing model of how does one deal with this. I mean, I grew up with parents telling me basically, not to enter into the secular world. So there's this issue of that. But I am who I am, and I have my values and my beliefs. And it's only in retrospect that I have much more respect to what my parents were trying to say, because that's where they came from, and that's how they felt, and that was their fears. Fortunately, what they gave me was enough sense of safety to be bold enough to do what I do. But that's not the case of all the, let's say, of my other relatives or other people that I grew up with. They're still, let's say, bonded or embedded in some of these traumatic narratives of, I gave a talk in Belfast. It was on the internet this time, but they're dealing with some of these, I would say some of these, but similar transgenerational issues. And you start realizing that the world is loaded with transgenerational features. I mean, it's like if you go to Europe, everyone was fighting everyone else in Europe, and they haven't forgotten it either. And this is the issue: is where does this lead us if we keep dealing with lacking the ability to forgive, lacking the ability to have compassion, which is really, all these are features of, do we have the capacity to trust and to feel safe with another? Yeah. And each time we are feeling threat or feeling marginalized or feeling let's say, not allowed to join the larger culture, we lose part of ourselves. And this is the part, by the way, living in the United States and going through what we're going through here now is, I never expected the type of political division or divisiveness as I'm experiencing. It's hard to believe this. Especially for, as we say, coming of age in the 60s with this great expectation of a world of more, let's say, more compassion. We could say the world of love, but we really were talking about compassion and acceptance and respect for others. To see things not just thought, but actually articulated in public is very jolting. Yeah.
Yes. So look, in summary, whether it's working with, generationally transferred Holocaust trauma, whether it's working with learning trauma from the school systems or going to the synagogues and the yeshivas to pray, what we're really talking about consistently, the theme is one of safety, getting the body into a place of safety, which then frees us to really be the person I could be.
Yeah, I kind of push it one step further. I'm going to say, and actually, we can label it as a God-given toolkit. We can use any terminology we want. But we as a species have this wonderful gift to turn off threat, to turn off our threat reactions. And we do that through that ventral vagal circuit that's sitting there waiting for cues of safety to turn off our threat. It's there. We have the structure. And this is part of where my message in medicine is about. Why not recruit this in your medicine so that the body can do its own healing? But again, within medicine, we have a model in which the body isn't doing the healing. The surgeon or the physician or the pharmaceuticals do the healing. And we have the same model when it comes to learning. We're being taught. We're not enabling the individual to learn. And so when we go back full circuit through our circle through our dialogue, when you want to bring up this concept of free will, it's really, Polyvagal Theory provides us with the opportunity to experience and to express free will, to become who we are.
Beautiful. Wow, that's right. We've come full circle. Yeah. I am very honored to have had this time with you. And, it's been tremendously informative. And I really hope that we make a bridge together where we can bring information that's non-threatening to our community that we can embrace and enhance and become really who we will, God intended us to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. A word I'd like to use, or a phrase, is claim our heritage. We're claiming our heritage as a compassionate, loving species.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And I actually, part of our dialogues in the future,
yes.
I would love to start talking about how, in a sense, the Judaic traditions and the prayers, and even the, let's say, the more mystic dialogues underneath it are about the same thing.
Totally. Totally. So let's end with one. Should we end with one, a good one? Just to,
yeah.
We had mentioned, you and I, in the emails about the line of Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you had said to me at the time, how does a declaration, really help us? To which I'd commented that the Talmud says very clearly that one's meant to hear that which comes out. It's meant to be embodied. To embody it is key. Hear, O Israel, is hear myself.
Yeah.
I have to hear and embody that and live it, believe it. Declaring it doesn't do us anything.
So the beauty is, if it were retranslated into listen, O Israel, then in Chinese, the Chinese word for listen embodies ear, heart, and brain. It's everything. And that's what, so again, if we play with the translations, if it really was meant to listen, then...
Well, it goes even deeper, because the real translation is understand.
Yeah. Or we could say embody.
Embody, exactly.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. And we'll see each other next week.
Yes, we will. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Take care. Be well. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. L'throat.
Yeah. Bye-bye. L'throat. Bye-bye.